Good evening. You're watching Fear Knocks. Tonight's story starts quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't comfort you. It makes you listen harder. A light thins for a beat. A door clicks with no one near it. Something shifts in the air like the room just remembered you're in it. The people who reported this aren't easily shaken. These are night shift staff, drivers, the ones who know what normal sounds like down to the smallest detail. So when they say something felt wrong, it's because every instinct they have told them this moment wasn't random. Stay with this one. It builds slow, but every second matters. And if stories like this pull you in, subscribe to Fear Knocks. We drop new, true horror every day. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and which moment hits you the hardest. It helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming. All right, let's get into it. I was the charge nurse on duty that night, overseeing the intensive care unit. A late autumn storm front had brought a sharp cold and a steady rain against the windows. The first sign of trouble was a subtle, almost imperceptible dip in the overhead lighting. It happened just as I was reviewing the shift change reports at the central station. The fluorescent panels above flickered, a momentary hesitation in their steady glow. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the glass of the main entrance doors down the hall. A low, almost inaudible hum from the ventilation system seemed to waver for a fraction of a second. It was the kind of detail you only notice when you are accustomed to the constant background noise of a critical care environment. My eyes instinctively went to the patient monitors, checking the waveforms and numerical displays. Everything appeared stable, but the brief flicker had registered. I made a mental note, attributing it to the weather. The storm had been building for hours, pushing a dense fog across the city. The air in the unit felt slightly cooler than usual, a faint chill that seeped in despite the building's climate control. I glanced at the clock on the wall, noting the time just after 7 in the evening. The shift was still settling in, and the long night stretched ahead. The unit was quiet, save for the rhythmic whoosh of ventilators and the soft beeps of infusion pumps. This brief, almost unnoticeable sag in power felt like a prelude, a quiet whisper of something larger to come. My role as charge nurse involved constant vigilance over the unit's operations. We managed a diverse group of patients, each relying on a complex array of life support equipment. Ventilators, IV pumps, dialysis machines, and cardiac monitors all drew power from the hospital's main grid. Our standard operating procedures for power events were drilled into us regularly. Every nurse knew the location of the manual resuscitation bags and the protocols for their immediate deployment. We understood the sequence: mains power loss, uninterruptible power supply bridge, automatic transfer switch engagement, and then the diesel generator taking over. It was a well-rehearsed ballet of systems designed to maintain continuous care. The ICU itself was a series of glass-fronted pods, allowing for clear visibility of each patient from the central nursing station. This open design was crucial for rapid response. Beyond the patient areas, the hospital's infrastructure hummed with its own life. The plant corridor, a utilitarian artery, connected the critical care areas to the mechanical rooms. There, the massive diesel genset stood ready, a silent guardian against grid failures. Oxygen and vacuum panels lined the walls, their gauges typically holding steady. We relied on these systems implicitly, trusting the engineering behind them. The night shift often brought a heightened sense of isolation, a feeling amplified by the storm outside. The real event began about a minute later. It was not a sudden blackout, but a slow, deliberate sag. The overhead lights dimmed noticeably, not flickering this time, but fading to perhaps half their usual intensity. The change was gradual, like a slow sunset happening indoors. Then came the sound, a chorus of high-pitched chirps from every piece of bedside equipment. Each ventilator, each monitor, each infusion pump, all simultaneously announced their transition to internal battery power. The sound was sharp, insistent, and immediate. It cut through the usual hum of the unit. I immediately called out for the other nurses to check their patients. My eyes darted to the remote annunciator panel, a small screen mounted near the central station that displayed critical system statuses. It glowed with a new alert. Mains power loss, ICU. The main grid had failed. This was not a flicker. This was a full brownout. The uninterruptible power supply, or UPS, had engaged as designed, providing a seamless bridge of power to the critical equipment. For a few seconds, the unit was powered by a massive bank of batteries located in the basement. The ventilation system's hum became a low growl, struggling against the reduced input. I moved quickly to the nearest patient pod, checking the ventilator display. It showed UPS power clearly. The oxygen manifold pressure gauges, usually rock steady, showed a slight, almost imperceptible dip, then stabilized. This was a good sign. The primary oxygen supply was still holding. I could hear the distinct clack of relays from the ATS alcove, a sound that meant the automatic transfer switch was attempting to engage the backup generator. This was the critical phase, the transition from battery to generator power. The entire unit held its breath, waiting for the familiar roar of the diesel engine. The chirping alarms continued, a constant reminder of our precarious state. I instructed a nurse to prepare the manual bagging stands, ensuring they were ready for immediate use if the ventilators failed to transfer. Another nurse began a quick check of all patient vital signs, documenting everything on their bedside notes. The air in the unit felt heavy, charged with a strange static electricity. The dim lighting cast long, unfamiliar shadows across the floor. The storm outside seemed to intensify, the rain now a drumming on the roof, the wind a low moan. We waited. The chirps continued. Then, after what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a few seconds, the lights brightened slightly. Not to full power, but to a level above the dimness of the brownout. A new, deeper hum began to vibrate through the floor, a sound that started low and slowly built in intensity. This was the diesel generator, now online and warming up. The annunciator panel updated. Generator online, warm-up phase. The relief was palpable, but brief. The ventilators, however, were not happy. Their chirps changed in tone, becoming more erratic. Some displayed frequency drift warnings. The generator was running, but its output frequency was not yet stable enough for the sensitive electronics of the medical equipment. This was a known failure mode, a common issue during the initial warm-up phase. The UPS batteries were still carrying the load, but they could not last indefinitely. We were in a race against time, waiting for the generator to stabilize its output. The manual bagging stands were now fully prepared, each nurse standing by their assigned patient, hands hovering over the resuscitation bags. The silence from the main power grid was absolute, replaced by the generator's growing rumble and the persistent, anxious chirping of the machines. The frequency drift was the most concerning aspect. Modern ventilators are highly sensitive to power quality. An unstable frequency could cause them to shut down, even with UPS power still available. The chirping alarms intensified, some units briefly cutting out before the UPS kicked them back on with a small jolt. I could see the nurses' faces, illuminated by the dim light, etched with a quiet tension. Their focus was absolute, their hands ready. I moved to the central documentation station, pulling up the hospital's internal facilities dashboard on a small, battery-backed monitor. The screen showed the generator's output frequency fluctuating, slowly climbing towards the stable 60 Hz mark, but still bouncing around. It was like watching a needle on a seismograph during a minor tremor. The facilities office was likely already aware, but I placed a quick call to their emergency line. The line rang several times before a tired voice answered, confirming they were monitoring the situation. They reported that the main grid had experienced a significant sag across the entire district, not just a localized outage. The storm had caused widespread issues, with reports of downed lines and widespread frost on power infrastructure. Back in the unit, the air felt colder now, a subtle drop in temperature that suggested the building's main heating systems were also affected. The storm outside continued its assault, the wind howling around the roof exhaust stacks. I could almost feel the cold seeping through the walls. The generator's hum grew louder, a deep, resonant vibration that permeated the entire floor. It was a sound of raw power, but also of a system under immense strain. The annunciator panel flashed a new message. Generator stabilizing. Frequency correction in progress. This was the critical moment. We needed that frequency to lock in. I watched the patient monitors, specifically the ventilator displays. One by one, the frequency drift warnings began to clear. The chirping alarms softened, then ceased on some machines, replaced by the steady, rhythmic whoosh of normal operation. It was a slow, agonizing process, taking what felt like many minutes. I instructed the nurses to continue monitoring their patients closely, even as the alarms subsided. We had to ensure the ventilators had fully re-established stable operation. The oxygen and vacuum panels were still holding steady, a testament to their independent backup systems. The hospital's emergency power system was performing its function, albeit with a terrifying delay in stabilization. The quiet dread that had settled over the unit began to recede, replaced by a cautious relief. We were not out of the woods, but the immediate crisis seemed to be passing. The dim lighting remained, a constant reminder that we were still on backup power. The generator continued its deep thrum, a constant presence beneath our feet. We had navigated the immediate danger, but the night was far from over. The generator ran for several hours, providing stable power until the main grid was restored sometime before dawn. The transition back to utility power was smoother, almost unnoticed by the patients. The overhead lights brightened to their full intensity with a soft pop, and the generator's hum slowly faded into silence. We documented every detail in the shift report and the hospital's incident log. Each nurse added notes to their patient charts, detailing the duration of UPS power and the generator's stabilization period. The facilities team later provided a full report, confirming the mains sag and the successful, if delayed, ATS sequence. They noted the frequency drift was within expected parameters for a cold start under load. The event was filed away, another entry in the hospital's long history of power events. The cold outside had eased slightly with the rising sun, but the memory of the dim, chirping unit remained. Even now, years later, a sudden dip in household lights can trigger a faint echo of that night. The memory of the collective chirp, the dimness, and the agonizing wait for the generator to stabilize its frequency still lingers. It was a procedural horror, a quiet demonstration of how fragile our reliance on technology truly is. I sometimes hear that low, struggling hum of the ventilation system in my mind, a sound that spoke of systems on the edge. It was the sound of the hospital breathing, almost failing, in the dark. I was the facilities tech on duty, covering the night shift during a late autumn storm. The air outside was barely above freezing, and a thick fog had settled over the hospital grounds. A faint, tinny clicking sound began to carry through the ventilation system, an anomaly in the usual mechanical hum. My routine on nights like this was predictable, a careful dance with the hospital's critical infrastructure. I would start by checking the main diesel genset, ensuring it was warmed and ready for an automatic transfer switch sequence. The plant corridor, usually bustling, was quiet. The only sounds the low thrum of machinery and the distant, muffled calls from the ICU pods. I carried a small radio, mostly for dispatch calls, but it often crackled with static from the weather. The hospital was a complex organism, and my job was to keep its heart beating, especially when the outside world raged. I would log my rounds in a worn logbook, noting meter readings and system statuses. The isolation of the night shift was a constant companion, broken only by the occasional nurse passing through or the quiet beep of a medical device. The clicking persisted, a rhythmic, metallic whisper that seemed to echo off the polished floors of the plant corridor. It was too regular to be a loose panel or a dripping pipe. I followed the sound, moving past the oxygen and vacuum panels, their gauges steady. The noise led me toward the ICU wing, specifically to a small, unmarked telecom closet tucked away in an alcove near the nurse documentation stations. The door was solid, made of painted steel, and secured with a heavy-duty lock. The sound was clearly emanating from within, a distinct relay chatter, not loud, but insistent. It was the kind of sound that suggested a circuit opening and closing rapidly, repeatedly. I pressed my ear against the cool metal of the door. The tinny click was unmistakable, a series of rapid, almost frantic pulses. This closet housed an auxiliary automatic transfer switch, or ATS, for a subset of critical ICU equipment. It was a redundant system, rarely active, and certainly not designed to chatter like this. I walked to the remote annunciator panel, located in a small office near the main facilities hub. This panel provided a real-time overview of all critical power systems. My eyes scanned the illuminated indicators, searching for any red lights or warning messages. The main ATS showed normal operation, drawing power from the utility grid. The generator status was green, indicating readiness. Then I saw it. The indicator for the auxiliary ATS in the ICU telecom closet was amber. Below it, a small backlit label read, "Bypass armed." This was highly unusual. The bypass function was a manual override, typically engaged only during maintenance or specific testing procedures. It should not have been armed, especially not without a corresponding work order or my direct involvement. I checked the digital display for any fault codes. It showed a momentary phase imbalance warning, which then cleared itself, replaced by a generic system anomaly message. The display then reverted to a normal standby status, but the bypass armed light remained. I tried to reach dispatch on my radio, but the static was heavy, making communication difficult. I could barely make out the garbled responses. I returned to the telecom closet, the clicking now seeming louder, more urgent. It was a dry, mechanical sound, but its persistence in the quiet hospital night gave it an unsettling quality. I retrieved my master keys from the facilities office. The heavy ring clinked softly as I selected the correct key for the closet door. My hand felt the cold metal of the doorknob. I inserted the key, turned it, and the lock mechanism gave a solid, mechanical thunk. I pulled the door open slowly, revealing the interior. The closet was small, barely large enough for one person to stand comfortably. Inside, racks of network equipment hummed softly, their indicator lights blinking in a steady rhythm. The auxiliary ATS unit was mounted on the far wall, a gray metal box with a clear plastic cover. The clicking sound intensified dramatically as the door opened, now a rapid, almost frantic series of mechanical actions. It was coming directly from the ATS unit itself. I carefully examined the unit. The clear cover allowed me to see the internal relays, small rectangular components with visible contacts. One particular relay was visibly activating, its armature snapping back and forth with incredible speed. It was generating the tinny click I had heard. I checked the unit's local display. It mirrored the remote annunciator, bypass armed. There was no other fault code, no indication of a power surge or a frequency drift. The input voltage and frequency readings were stable, well within operational parameters. I pulled out my handheld multimeter, its probes cool against my gloved fingers. I carefully checked the voltage across the bypass contacts. The reading was nominal, showing no active current flow through the bypass circuit. This meant the bypass was armed, but not active. The relays were chattering as if trying to engage, but the main power path remained undisturbed. It was a phantom action, a machine trying to do something it wasn't actually doing. I consulted the digital logbook on my tablet, cross-referencing the auxiliary ATS's serial number with its maintenance history. A bypass test had been performed earlier that week, a routine check, but the log clearly stated the bypass had been disarmed and the system returned to normal operation. There was no record of it being re-armed. I tried to reason through the possibilities. A faulty control board? A software glitch? But the physical relay was moving, clicking with undeniable force. The sound carried through the metal ductwork of the ventilation system, a constant, irritating presence. I could feel a faint vibration in the floor beneath my feet, a resonance from the rapid clicking. The air in the closet felt still and cool, despite the heat generated by the electronic equipment. The static on my radio seemed to worsen, making it impossible to get a clear signal from dispatch. It felt like the hospital itself was holding its breath, listening to the relentless chatter. I stood there for a few minutes, observing the frantic relay. It was a machine in a state of internal conflict, trying to engage a function that was not called for, yet not truly failing. The bypass armed status was a ghost in the system, a memory of a past action that refused to clear. I considered the implications. If this phantom bypass were to fully engage, it could disrupt power to critical life support equipment in the ICU. The thought sent a cold shiver through me. I knew I had to clear it. There was a small recessed reset button on the ATS unit. It was protected by a clear plastic guard, requiring a deliberate action to press. I took a deep breath, the air in the closet smelling faintly of ozone and dust. I pressed the button firmly. The clicking stopped instantly. The silence that followed was profound, almost deafening after the relentless chatter. The bypass armed indicator on the local display and the remote annunciator panel extinguished. The system reverted to a normal standby status. I checked the voltage readings again with my meter. Everything was stable. I ran a diagnostic check from the local panel. All systems reported normal. There was no new fault code, no lingering anomaly. It was as if the incident had never occurred, save for the memory of the sound. I closed the telecom closet door, locking it securely. I then returned to the facilities office and made a detailed entry in the logbook. Auxiliary ATS, ICU telecom closet. Phantom relay chatter observed. Annunciator showed bypass armed after prior test. Reset performed. System cleared. No active fault codes. I filed a formal report detailing the observations and the procedural steps taken. The official notes offered no explanation for the phantom chatter, I still hear it sometimes, that tinny, rapid clicking. It surfaces in the quiet hum of the hospital, a faint echo in the ventilation system. It was just a machine, I tell myself, a glitch in the complex dance of power and control. But the memory of that sound, trying to engage a function that wasn't there, in the dead of night, remains. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and which moment hit you the hardest. I always check. I was on the night shift, working as a respiratory therapist in the intensive care unit. Outside, a late autumn storm front was moving through, bringing a sharp cold and intermittent rain. Just after midnight, the overhead lights in our pod flickered once, then settled back to their usual steady glow. The hospital was generally quiet during these hours, especially in the ICU. Most patients were sedated, and the only sounds were the rhythmic hum of ventilators and the soft beeps of monitors. My routine involved rounds, checking ventilator settings, suctioning airways, and documenting patient status. The air inside was kept at a comfortable temperature, a stark contrast to the biting cold that pressed against the building's exterior. I had just finished my rounds on the west side of the unit, making my way back to the central documentation station. The floor tiles felt cool beneath my shoes, and the only other movement was the distant, almost imperceptible sway of tree branches visible through a high window. The storm had been building since early evening. Dispatch had warned of high winds and potential power disruptions across the region. Our facility was equipped with robust backup systems, including a large diesel generator and uninterruptible power supplies for critical areas. We had experienced minor brownouts before, brief dips in voltage that caused lights to dim for a moment, but never a full mains loss during my shifts. The hospital's internal systems were designed to handle these fluctuations seamlessly, transferring power without interruption to essential services. I had checked the oxygen manifold pressures earlier, noting they were stable, and confirmed the manual ventilation fallback bags were readily available at each bedside. The procedural checks were ingrained, a second nature that provided a quiet reassurance in the face of external chaos. I was logging my last patient assessment when it happened. A distinct, three-tone chime echoed through the pod. It was the sound of a patient admit, the specific alert that signaled a new arrival had been registered to a bed. I paused, my pen hovering over the chart. This was unusual. New admits rarely occurred in the dead of night unless it was an emergency transfer, and even then, we would typically receive a verbal heads-up from the charge nurse. The sound seemed to originate from the far end of the pod, near Bay 6. Bay 6 was empty. It had been vacant for nearly a week, awaiting a deep clean and equipment recalibration. I glanced at the charge nurse, who was also looking up, a faint frown on her face. We exchanged a brief, unspoken question. The quiet hum of the unit continued, but the chime had introduced a subtle tension. I pushed away from the documentation station, my shoes making a soft squeak on the polished floor as I walked towards the bay. The glass doors of the pod reflected the muted overhead lighting, creating a long, distorted corridor of my own movement. As I approached Bay 6, the bed panel, usually dark and inert when unoccupied, was faintly illuminated. Its small screen displayed a generic welcome message, then flickered to a status screen. The three-tone chime repeated, softer this time, almost like a whisper. It was the same sequence, clear and unmistakable. I could feel the cold air from the storm outside pressing against the building, a subtle chill that seemed to permeate even the thick hospital walls. The only other sound was the distant rumble of the diesel generator, now audible. indicating the auto transfer switch had engaged. I stepped into the bay. The bed itself was stripped, the mattress bare, the IV pole folded against the wall. There was no patient, no belongings, no medical equipment beyond the standard wall-mounted oxygen and vacuum panels. The bed panel screen showed a patient present flag, along with a generic patient ID number that was clearly a placeholder. This was impossible. The system should not register a patient in an empty bay, especially not with an admit chime. I checked the nurse call station on the wall. Its small indicator light was off, as it should be. The room was otherwise still, save for the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. I tried to clear the alarm from the bedside panel. My fingers pressed the clear button, but nothing happened. The patient present flag remained stubbornly lit. The system was stuck. I walked over to the wall-mounted oxygen and vacuum panels, checking their gauges. Everything appeared normal. The air felt still, almost heavy, despite the constant circulation. The storm outside seemed to intensify for a moment, and I heard a faint rattle from the roof exhaust stacks above. I knew this was a system glitch, likely a consequence of the voltage dip we had just experienced. The auto transfer switch had likely sequenced, causing a momentary interruption that confused the bed's internal logic. Still, the persistent chime and the patient present flag in an empty room were unsettling. It felt like a ghost in the machine, a digital echo of a presence that wasn't there. I made a note on my small pad, detailing the exact time of the chime and the observed status on the bed panel. The procedural steps were clear, but the situation itself felt anything but. I walked back to the central nurse documentation station and accessed the hospital's electronic health record system. I pulled up the bed management module. Bay 6 was indeed listed as vacant and available for cleaning. There was no record of an admit, no patient assigned. The system's main database contradicted the local bed panel. This discrepancy was the core of the problem. I tried to remotely clear the bed status from the central console, but the option was grayed out. The system seemed to believe a patient was physically in the bed, overriding any remote commands. I called the charge nurse over. She reviewed the screen, her expression mirroring my own quiet concern. "It's a stale presence flag," she murmured, a technical term for a sensor error that falsely indicates occupancy. "The system thinks someone's there, but the central server knows better." She suggested I contact facilities. The plant corridor, where the facilities office was located, was a long walk from the ICU, past the diesel genset room and the ATS alcove. The hospital was a labyrinth at night, especially during a storm. I grabbed my radio. The static crackled briefly before I connected with facilities. I explained the situation calmly, detailing the voltage dip, the 3-tone chime, and the patient present flag in Bay 6. The facilities technician, a man named Mark, sounded tired but professional. He said he would check the remote annunciator panel in his office and then head up to the ICU. The hum of the generator was a constant, low thrum in the background of our conversation, a reminder of the storm's continued presence. While waiting for Mark, I returned to Bay 6. The bed panel was still lit, the patient present flag unwavering. I stood there for a moment, listening. The unit was quiet again, the rhythmic breathing of the ventilators the dominant sound. But I could almost hear the faint echo of that 3-tone chime, a phantom sound that seemed to hang in the air. The cold outside felt more pronounced now, seeping through the windows, making the glass feel slick to the touch. I ran my hand over the smooth, cool surface of the bed panel, feeling the slight vibration of its internal electronics. Mark arrived about 15 minutes later, carrying a small diagnostic tablet. He was wearing a heavy work jacket, and I could see traces of frost on his shoulders, indicating he had been outside. He confirmed the remote annunciator panel in his office had also shown a bed occupied alert for Bay 6, despite the central system showing it vacant. This meant the error was localized to the bed's sensor, or its immediate connection to the network. He began his diagnostic routine, connecting his tablet to a port on the bed panel. The screen on his tablet displayed a cascade of technical data, a stream of numbers and codes that meant little to me, but everything to him. He worked methodically, checking connections, running diagnostics, and cross-referencing logs. He explained that the voltage dip likely caused a transient memory error in the bed's control board, latching onto a false, occupied state. It was a known, though rare, failure mode during frequency drift or phase imbalance events. He tried a soft reboot from his tablet, but the patient present flag remained. The three-tone chime did not repeat, but its absence did not diminish the unsettling feeling. The air in the bay felt heavy, almost stagnant, despite the constant circulation. Finally, Mark decided a hard reset was necessary. He located the circuit breaker for the bed's power supply in a small utility closet nearby. He warned me that cutting power would temporarily disable the bed's internal clock and memory, requiring a full recalibration once power was restored. I nodded, understanding the procedural implications. He flipped the breaker. The bed panel went dark instantly, plunging the bay into a deeper shadow. For a moment, the silence felt absolute, broken only by the distant hum of the generator. After about a minute, he restored power. The bed panel slowly came back to life, displaying a boot-up sequence. The patient present flag was gone. The screen now showed bed vacant, its normal inert state. Mark ran a final diagnostic, confirming the sensor was now reading correctly. He made a detailed entry in his logbook, noting the time, the incident, and the resolution. He also filed a report with the hospital's IT department for further investigation into the power event's impact on bedside equipment. The incident was officially closed, a technical anomaly resolved. I still think about that night sometimes. The specific three-tone chime, playing in an empty room, felt like a quiet announcement for someone who wasn't there. The cold outside, the hum of the generator, and the flickering lights all contributed to a sense of isolation. Even after the bed panel was cleared and the system returned to normal, a faint whisper of that false presence seemed to linger in the air of Bay 6. I sometimes catch myself listening for it, especially on stormy nights when the power dips just slightly. I was on duty as a plant runner, making my rounds through the hospital's lower levels. It was a late shift, well past midnight, and a heavy storm front was moving through the region. A low, persistent hum from the main electrical room felt slightly off, a subtle vibration against the concrete floor. My job involved monitoring the facility's critical infrastructure, especially during adverse weather. I checked the boiler room, the chiller plant, and the main electrical distribution panels. The hospital was a complex organism of interconnected systems, all designed to maintain a stable environment for patients in critical care. My routine was methodical, a series of visual inspections and meter readings, logged on a handheld device. The air in the plant corridor was usually warm, carrying the faint scent of ozone and diesel. Tonight, the temperature felt a little cooler than usual, a slight chill seeping in despite the building's robust insulation. The wind outside howled, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the thick walls. Rain lashed against the roof stacks, a constant hiss that blended with the mechanical thrum of the building. The first indication of a problem was not an alarm, but a change in the building's ambient sound. The low thrum from the main electrical room deepened, then wavered, like a large engine struggling to find its rhythm. I was in the ATS alcove, checking the automatic transfer switch status lights. The mains indicator flickered, a brief, almost imperceptible dip in illumination. Then it went out completely. The emergency generator sequence initiated immediately. I heard the distant roar of the diesel engine starting up in the generator room, a sound that always brought a sense of urgency. The hospital's internal lights dimmed for a moment, then brightened as the uninterruptible power supply units engaged, bridging the gap. This was normal procedure during a power loss. The ATS would sense the stable generator power and switch over within seconds. I watched the ATS panel. The generator power indicator illuminated, a steady green. The transfer sequence began. There was a solid click as the main breakers engaged, connecting the hospital to its emergency power source. The hum of the building stabilized, a deeper, more resonant thrum now, powered by the diesel engine. I noted the time on my logbook, a routine entry for a power event. The storm outside intensified, the wind now a sustained roar, and the rain hammered down, creating a dense fog that pressed against the windows of the plant corridor. I radioed dispatch, confirming the transfer to generator power. They acknowledged, asking for a status update on the ICU pods. My next step was to verify the generator's stability and then check the critical care units. I walked towards the generator room, the floor vibrating beneath my boots. The diesel engine was running smoothly, its exhaust stacks venting the warm gases into the stormy night. I checked the fuel levels and the oil pressure, all within nominal ranges. The sound was a powerful, rhythmic beat, a testament to the machine's capability. I then headed towards the main plant corridor, which led to the hospital's central core. The air in the corridor was now noticeably cooler, and I felt a faint, intermittent draft. This was unusual. The building was designed to maintain positive pressure, preventing outside air from infiltrating. As I approached the main elevator bank, I noticed something else. The heavy canvas fire curtains, usually hanging still, were fluttering. They lifted inward, then settled, then lifted again, in a slow, rhythmic pulse. It was as if something was gently inhaling and exhaling within the building itself. I stopped, watching the curtains. The movement was too regular to be a random draft. I checked the nearest air pressure gauge, a small digital display mounted on the wall. It showed a slight negative pressure reading, fluctuating by a few pascals. This was not right. The HVAC system should have been maintaining a steady positive pressure, especially in a critical care facility. I radioed the HVAC control room but received no immediate answer. The storm was causing static on the line, making communication difficult. I decided to proceed to the ICU pods, where the effects of any pressure anomaly would be most critical. As I moved through the corridors, the fluttering of curtains became more pronounced. In some areas, the emergency exit doors, designed to seal tightly, seemed to pull inward slightly with each pulse, then relax. I could hear a faint, almost imperceptible whisper of air being drawn through the door seams. The building felt like it was breathing around me. Reaching the ICU, I found the unit operating on generator power, the lights steady. Nurses were at their documentation stations, their faces illuminated by the screens. Everything appeared normal at first glance. Then I noticed the curtains around the patient beds. They were lifting, just slightly, in a synchronized, rhythmic movement. Each lift was gentle, a slow, almost lazy rise, followed by an equally slow fall. It was the same pulse I had observed with the canvas curtains in the plant corridor. The effect was subtle, but unmistakable. It was happening across the entire unit. I approached a nurse at the central station. She looked up, her expression tired. I asked if she had noticed anything unusual. She paused, then gestured vaguely towards the curtains. "They've been doing that since the power flickered," she said, her voice low. "Just a little draft, I guess." I knew it was more than a draft. I pulled out my handheld manometer, a small device used to measure air pressure differentials. Holding it near a closed patient room door, I watched the readings. The display showed a consistent negative pressure inside the room, fluctuating in time with the curtain movements. The building was indeed pulling air inward, then releasing the suction, over and over. I moved quickly to the oxygen manifold room. The main oxygen supply lines were fed by large tanks, with a backup system in place. The pressure gauges here were critical. They showed stable readings, thankfully. The vacuum panels, which provided suction for medical procedures, also appeared normal. The negative pressure was not affecting these vital systems directly, but it indicated a significant HVAC imbalance. I radioed the facilities office, hoping to reach someone who could check the remote annunciator panel for HVAC alarms. The static was still heavy, but I managed to relay the situation. The pulsing continued. It was not violent, but persistent. The curtains in the ICU pods lifted and fell, a silent, synchronized ballet. The air felt thin, almost hollow, with each inward pull. I could feel the subtle pressure changes against my skin. It was unsettling, the sensation of the building itself contracting and expanding. I walked back to the plant corridor, checking the main air handlers. No alarms were visible on their local panels. The problem seemed to be systemic, affecting the entire building envelope. I considered the roof exhaust stacks. The storm was still raging, and the wind could be creating a Venturi effect, pulling air out of the building through the stacks, overwhelming the supply fans. I decided to make a roof check, despite the weather. I grabbed my heavy-duty rain gear and a powerful flashlight. The climb to the roof access hatch was steep and narrow. The wind howled through the stairwell, a raw, cold sound. Opening the hatch, I was immediately hit by a blast of freezing rain and wind. The fog was so thick, I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I moved cautiously, my boots finding purchase on the wet, metal grating of the roof. The exhaust stacks loomed like dark, breathing monoliths in the swirling mist. I could hear the deep roar of the generator's exhaust, a powerful, steady sound. As I approached the main HVAC exhaust stacks, I could feel the immense suction. The wind was indeed creating a powerful negative pressure, pulling air out of the building with incredible force. The dampers, designed to regulate airflow, were struggling against the gale. They were opening and closing slightly with each gust, creating the rhythmic pulses of negative pressure I had observed inside. The building was literally exhaling through its stacks, then drawing a shallow breath as the wind momentarily eased. I radioed my findings to the facilities office, the static making my voice crackle. I explained the wind effect on the stacks and the struggling dampers. They acknowledged, stating they would try to adjust the fan speeds from the central control system, though remote access was limited due to the storm. I stayed on the roof for a few more minutes, observing the stacks. The pulsing was undeniable, a slow, powerful intake and release of air. The building was breathing, a deep, mechanical respiration forced by the storm. The cold rain soaked through my gear, and the wind threatened to pull me off my feet. I could feel the building shuddering beneath me, a living entity struggling against the elements. The thought of the patients below, relying on the stability of this structure, was a heavy one. I descended back into the relative calm of the hospital, the sound of the wind slowly fading behind me. The facilities team eventually managed to adjust the fan speeds, compensating for the wind-induced suction. Slowly, over the next hour, the negative pressure readings on my manometer began to stabilize. The rhythmic fluttering of the curtains in the ICU pods lessened, then stopped. the subtle whisper of air through door seams faded. The building settled back into its normal, steady hum. The storm eventually passed, and mains power was restored a few hours later. I logged the incident, detailing the power loss, the generator transfer, and the HVAC pressure anomaly. My report included the observations from the roof and the actions taken. The official notes attributed the event to extreme wind conditions, overwhelming the HVAC system's ability to maintain pressure balance during generator operation. There was no damage, no patient harm, just a procedural incident. I still think about it sometimes, especially on stormy nights. The way the building seemed to breathe, a slow, deep inhalation and exhalation, forced by the wind and the struggling machinery. I can still feel that subtle pull of air, the silent lifting of the curtains, the whisper through the door seams. It was a reminder of how fragile even the most robust systems can be, and how close we always are to the edge of control. I was the charge nurse working the night shift in the intensive care unit. The air conditioning kept the unit cool, a constant low hum filling the space. Then, a subtle shift in the ambient light hinted at something unusual. My routine on those shifts was a precise rhythm of observation and intervention. The ICU was a world of controlled variables, each patient a complex system requiring constant vigilance. I moved between the glass-fronted pods, checking monitors, adjusting infusions, and ensuring the delicate balance of life support systems. The soft glow from the screens illuminated my path, reflecting off the polished floors. The only sounds were the gentle beeps of cardiac monitors and the quiet whoosh of ventilators. It was a place where every fractional change held significance. The unit felt like an island of intense focus, isolated from the world outside its walls. We relied entirely on the steady flow of power to maintain this fragile stability. Every piece of equipment, from the smallest syringe pump to the largest dialysis machine, drew its life from the electrical grid. My responsibility extended beyond direct patient care. It included an awareness of the entire operational infrastructure supporting our critical work. The logbook at the nurses' station held a record of every shift, every observation, every intervention, a testament to the relentless demands of the unit. The storm front had been moving in for hours, a distant rumble that slowly grew into a persistent growl. Rain began to lash against the windows, a steady drumming that competed with the internal hum of the unit. A flash of lightning, brighter than any I had seen that night, momentarily bleached the world outside the glass doors. It was followed by a thunderclap that vibrated through the floor. Immediately, the lights in Pod C flickered. Not a complete blackout, but a noticeable dip, then a surge. The overhead fluorescents buzzed with a different pitch for a moment before settling back into their usual hum. My eyes went straight to the patient monitors. All seemed stable, but a faint, almost imperceptible change in the sound of the syringe pumps caught my attention. These pumps were designed for precision, delivering critical medications in minute quantities. Each one had a small internal motor, and their collective operation created a low, steady whir. Now, the whir was uneven, a subtle desynchronization that was more felt than heard. I walked quickly to Pod C, my gaze sweeping across the bank of pumps attached to the IV poles. The digital displays on several pumps were fluctuating, the milliliter per hour readings wavering by small, inconsistent increments. This was not a normal operational variation. A patient monitor in the corner emitted a soft, high-pitched chirp, indicating a minor parameter excursion, quickly self-correcting. The air in the pod carried a faint, sharp scent, almost like ozone. a smell often associated with electrical discharge. I approached the first affected pump. Its keypad felt slightly warm to the touch. The display showed a current infusion rate, but the numbers seemed to shimmer, as if struggling to hold their value. I pressed the hold button on one pump, then another, pausing the infusions. This was a critical step, as even slight variations in medication delivery could have serious consequences for our patients. I checked the patient's vital signs, which remained stable for the moment. The other nurses in the unit had also noticed the anomaly. Their eyes met mine across the central station, a shared understanding of the gravity of the situation. The quiet dread began to settle in. This was not a simple power outage. Something more complex was at play. Something that affected the very precision of our life-sustaining equipment. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, the wind now whistling around the roof exhaust stacks, adding to the sense of isolation. I immediately contacted facilities. The plant operator, a man named Mark, answered on the second ring. His voice was calm, but I could hear the background hum of machinery, louder than usual. I described the flickering lights, the ozone smell, and the erratic pump readings in Pod C. He confirmed that they had registered a significant power event. A lightning strike had impacted a transformer not far from the hospital, causing a momentary mains loss. The auto transfer switch had engaged, bringing the diesel genset online. He explained that one of the phase legs had surged high during the transfer, creating an imbalance in the electrical supply to certain sections of the hospital. This imbalance was likely causing the pumps to desynchronize. He was already in the diesel genset room, monitoring the system. While Mark worked on the generator, we initiated manual checks. Each nurse in Pod C began the painstaking process of verifying every infusion. This involved physically counting drops per minute for gravity infusions and performing manual milliliter checks for the syringe pumps. We had to ensure that patients were receiving their prescribed dosages, even if the equipment was compromised. I moved to the breaker panel for Pod C, located in a small alcove off the main corridor. The panel cover felt cool and metallic under my fingers. I could hear a faint, high-frequency whine emanating from within. The indicator lights on the panel showed a slight discrepancy in voltage readings across the phases, confirming Mark's assessment. The remote annunciator panel, located near the facilities office, would be showing similar fault codes, I knew. The process of manual verification was slow and meticulous. We had to calculate drip rates based on patient weight and medication concentration, then adjust the roller clamps on the IV lines by hand. For the syringe pumps, we drew small samples from the lines to verify the actual volume delivered over a short period, comparing it against the prescribed rate. The keypad tick of the pumps as we adjusted settings was a constant, low sound. The alarm chirp from patient monitors became more frequent, though still minor, as the slight variations in medication delivery caused momentary physiological shifts. We worked with a focused intensity, our movements precise and deliberate. The cold, sterile environment of the ICU felt even more stark under the circumstances. We were operating on instinct and training, relying on our hands and eyes rather than the sophisticated electronics that usually guided us. Mark called back about 20 minutes later. He reported that the genset had synchronized fully and the phase imbalance was clearing. He had adjusted the generator's output, slowly bringing the voltage and frequency back into specification. I could hear the change in the background hum of the hospital, a return to its familiar, steady tone. Gradually, the digital displays on the syringe pumps in Pod C stabilized. The numbers stopped fluctuating, locking into their correct values. The internal motors of the pumps settled back into their synchronized whir. We continued our manual checks for a little while longer, cross-referencing the now stable pump readings with our manual calculations. Everything matched. The crisis had passed. We spent the next hour meticulously documenting every step of the incident. Each patient's bedside notes received detailed entries regarding the power event, the pump desynchronization, and the manual interventions performed. I logged the incident in the unit's official report, noting the time the imbalance occurred, the duration of the manual checks, and the resolution. The facilities department would have its own comprehensive file on the event, detailing the lightning strike and the generator's response. The quiet dread that had permeated the unit slowly receded, replaced by a lingering sense of vulnerability. We had navigated a critical failure, but it was a stark reminder of how dependent we were on a perfectly stable power supply. The storm eventually moved on, leaving behind a damp, cool night. The hum of the ICU returned to its normal, unwavering pitch. But sometimes, when the unit is particularly quiet, I still hear that subtle, uneven whir of the pumps, a ghost of the imbalance. It serves as a quiet whisper, a reminder of how close we came to losing control. I was the respiratory therapy lead on duty that night, overseeing the intensive care unit. My shift began as most did, reviewing patient charts and ensuring ventilator settings were within prescribed parameters. It was a late autumn night, the kind where a storm front had been gathering for hours, pressing against the city. The hospital's internal environment maintained a steady, controlled hum, a constant backdrop to the work. I moved between the ICU pods, the glass doors reflecting the soft glow of monitors. The air was kept at a comfortable temperature, a stark contrast to the cold that was surely building outside. My routine was methodical, a series of checks and double checks designed to catch any deviation. This particular night, however, held a subtle tension, a quiet anticipation of the weather's full arrival. The first hint of something amiss was barely perceptible. A flicker in the overhead fluorescent lights, so brief it might have been imagined. Then, a moment later, I noticed a faint, almost imperceptible dip in the needle of the oxygen manifold gauge, visible from the main nurse documentation station. It was a tiny movement, a momentary flutter that settled back into place almost immediately. I paused, watching it for a few seconds, but it remained steady. The incident registered as a minor anomaly, a blip in the otherwise stable environment. The intensive care unit operated on a principle of unwavering stability. Every system, from the power grid to the medical gas supply, was designed with multiple layers of redundancy. Our patients depended on this reliability, often breathing only with the assistance of complex machinery. My role as RT lead involved the constant awareness of these systems, understanding their normal operating ranges and the subtle indicators of potential trouble. A typical night shift involved rounds through the unit, checking each patient's respiratory status, suctioning airways, and adjusting ventilator modes as needed. The rhythmic whoosh and sigh of the ventilators were a familiar comfort, a sign of life sustained. We relied on a constant, high-pressure supply of medical oxygen delivered from large external tanks through a manifold system. This system automatically switched between primary and secondary banks as needed, ensuring an uninterrupted flow. The hospital also maintained backup generators and uninterruptible power supplies, ready to activate in the event of a mains power loss. We practiced for these scenarios regularly, but the real thing always carried a different weight. The storm outside had intensified, a low rumble of thunder now occasionally shaking the building's foundations. Rain lashed against the windows, creating a constant static sound. I was in the central corridor, heading towards the supply room, when the oxygen manifold gauge caught my eye again. This time, The needle's flutter was more pronounced, a distinct tremor that pulled it down a noticeable fraction before it bounced back. Almost simultaneously, a soft electronic beep sounded from one of the patient rooms, followed quickly by another from an adjacent pod. I moved quickly towards the manifold panel, my steps measured. The gauges were clear, brightly lit. The primary bank pressure was holding, but the needle for the main supply line dipped again, a more significant drop this time. It held low for a few seconds, then slowly, almost reluctantly, climbed back to its normal range. The brief hiss of gas from the manifold's internal regulators was audible, a sound usually masked by the general hum of the unit. Inside the patient rooms, 2 ventilators were now displaying amber, low O2 supply alarms. The patients themselves showed no immediate distress, their oxygen saturation levels holding steady, but the alarms were undeniable. My team members were already at the bedsides, checking connections, confirming the integrity of the oxygen lines. I instructed them to prepare for manual ventilation, just in case. The thought of having to manually bag a patient for an extended period, especially during a power event, was always a chilling prospect. I checked the pressure trend data on the central monitoring system. It confirmed a transient dip in the main oxygen line pressure, a momentary sag that lasted for about a minute. The system had recovered, but the event was unsettling. It was not a complete loss of pressure, but a significant reduction, enough to trigger alarms on sensitive equipment. The implications were clear. A critical system had wavered. The air in the plant corridor, usually warm, felt noticeably colder as I made my way towards the main oxygen supply room. The faint smell of diesel fuel, a scent usually confined to the generator room, seemed to permeate the air. I immediately contacted the facilities department. The voice on the other end was calm, but I could hear a subtle tension in his tone. He confirmed they were aware of a brief brownout on the main power grid. The hospital's auto transfer switch had initiated its sequence, preparing to shift to generator power. This process involved a momentary interruption, a fraction of a second where the system was vulnerable. During this precise moment, he explained, a routine testing procedure for transport bellows was underway in another part of the hospital. This testing had created a sudden, albeit temporary, spike in oxygen demand. I walked through the plant corridor, the concrete floor cold beneath my shoes. The hum of the building was different here, more industrial, less muffled. I passed the ATS alcove, a large metal cabinet housing the automatic transfer switch. Its indicator lights were steady now, showing mains power restored. The generator room, a few doors down, still had a faint, lingering hum, suggesting it had been running, warming up, before the mains power stabilized. The exhaust stacks on the roof, I knew, would have been expelling warm air into the cold night. I checked the main oxygen supply room. The primary and secondary banks of cylinders were intact, their gauges showing full pressure. The manifold system had indeed switched over seamlessly, but the brief demand spike during the power transition had caused the momentary pressure dip. It was a confluence of events, a perfect storm of minor incidents aligning to create a significant, if transient, threat. I cross-referenced the ventilator logbooks with my RT sheets, confirming the exact timings of the alarms and the patients affected. The data aligned perfectly with the facilities report. The system had ridden through the event, but the margin had been narrower than anyone preferred. The incident was officially logged, a detailed report filed outlining the sequence of events. The facility team conducted a thorough review of the auto transfer switch sequencing and the oxygen manifold's response to the demand spike. They confirmed that while the system had performed within its specifications, the combination of a brownout and simultaneous high-demand testing had created a unique stressor. There were no immediate changes to protocols, but the event served as a quiet reminder of the complex interplay of systems that kept the ICU functioning. The immediate crisis had passed, the alarms silenced, the gauges steady. A quiet relief settled over the unit, but it was tempered by a lingering tension. We had come close to a more serious situation, a momentary vulnerability that could have had severe consequences. The hospital continued its operations, the storm outside eventually moving on, leaving behind a cold, clear night. I still recall the precise way that oxygen needle fluttered. I can still hear the soft, insistent beep of those two ventilators. It was a quiet warning, a whisper of how fragile everything can be. I was performing my routine overnight rounds as a biomed technician when the first power fluctuation hit. It was a cold night in late autumn, the air outside thick with a low-lying fog that pressed against the hospital windows. The remote annunciator panel in the facilities office showed a momentary flicker, then settled back into its usual green glow. My job involved the maintenance and repair of all medical equipment, from infusion pumps to MRI machines. The night shift often meant quiet hours spent in the plant corridor, reviewing equipment logs or performing preventative checks on critical systems. I knew the hum of every generator, the specific whir of each air handler, and the subtle changes in the building's electrical static. This particular hospital was an older structure, but its critical care units were state-of-the-art, relying on a complex web of redundant power systems. We had a robust diesel genset, an automatic transfer switch, and multiple uninterruptible power supply units, or UPS systems, for the most sensitive equipment. The protocol for any power event was ingrained: observe, verify, and respond with precision. The initial flicker was just a precursor. About an hour later, the main utility feed dropped completely. The building plunged into a momentary silence, a deep, unsettling quiet that lasted only a few heartbeats. Then, the automatic transfer switch engaged with a solid, mechanical thunk, and the emergency generator roared to life outside. Its low-frequency hum vibrated through the concrete floors. Lights in the corridors flickered on, powered by the generator. The ICU pods, however, remained on their UPS systems, designed to ride through the transfer without interruption. I moved quickly to the main electrical room, checking the ATS status panel. It confirmed the transfer was successful. The generator was online, supplying power to the entire facility. I began my rounds of the critical care units, ensuring all bedside equipment was functioning correctly. The ICU nurses were already documenting the event, their screens glowing steadily. Dual-cord devices, like ventilators and patient monitors, had seamlessly switched to their secondary power inputs, drawing from the local UPS units. Everything appeared stable. The generator ran for what felt like a long time, perhaps an hour and a half, before the utility power was restored. I heard the distinct thunk of the ATS transferring back to mains, followed by a slight shift in the building's ambient hum. The generator spooled down, its roar fading into a low rumble, then silence. The hospital was back on grid power. I returned to the facilities office to check the annunciator panel. All indicators were green, confirming utility power was stable. However, one small detail caught my attention. The indicator for the main ICU UPS system, a large rack-mounted unit in the equipment room, remained amber. It signaled that the UPS was still operating on its internal batteries, despite the return of stable utility power. This was unusual. The system should have automatically transferred back to mains power once it detected a clean feed. I made a note in the logbook and headed towards the equipment room. The equipment room was a confined space, filled with the constant, high-pitched whine of inverters and the whoosh of cooling fans. The air inside was always a few degrees cooler than the adjacent corridor, a necessity for the sensitive electronics. I approached the main ICU UPS rack. Its front panel display confirmed the amber status. Battery discharge, mains available. The system was actively drawing power from its battery banks, even though the utility feed was present and stable. This meant the critical equipment in the ICU was still running on a finite power source, albeit a large one. The batteries would eventually deplete. I accessed the rack controller, a small touchscreen interface on the front of the unit. The system log showed the initial power loss, the transfer to battery, and then the return of mains power. But there was no entry for a transfer back to utility. The UPS was simply refusing to acknowledge the stable grid power. I tried a manual transfer command from the controller. The system beeped, and the screen displayed "Transfer failed, internal anomaly." A cold knot formed in my stomach. This was not a simple glitch. I contacted the on-call facilities manager, explaining the situation. He was about 3 miles away, already on his way in to check the generator logs. He advised me to try a soft reset of the UPS controller. I followed the procedure, navigating through the menus on the touchscreen. The system briefly paused, the inverter whine momentarily dropping in pitch, then resumed its steady hum. The amber light persisted. The UPS remained stubbornly on battery power. The facilities manager arrived a short while later, his breath visible in the cold night air as he entered the plant corridor. He reviewed the controller log with me, his brow furrowed. The log showed no error codes beyond the "transfer failed" message. We discussed the options. A hot swap of the controller module was possible, but risky, as it could potentially disrupt power to the ICU. The safest, albeit most disruptive option, was a cold reboot of the entire UPS rack. This would involve manually bypassing the UPS, transferring the ICU load directly to mains power, then shutting down the UPS completely before restarting it. The thought of even a momentary power interruption to the ICU was unsettling. We had to ensure every critical device was either dual-corded or had its own internal battery backup. I began the meticulous process of preparing for the cold reboot. First, I went back to the ICU pods, speaking quietly with the charge nurse. We confirmed that all ventilators, patient monitors, and infusion pumps were either connected to 2 separate power sources or had sufficient internal battery life to bridge a brief gap. The nurses began a manual documentation process, just in case. Back in the equipment room, the facilities manager and I carefully reviewed the wiring diagrams. The bypass procedure was complex, involving several manual switches and circuit breakers. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with a subtle static electricity that seemed to cling to my skin. The facilities manager took the lead on the electrical side, while I monitored the UPS controller and the ICU annunciator panel. He threw the first bypass switch with a decisive thunk. The inverter whine from the UPS changed pitch slightly, a subtle shift that only someone accustomed to the sound would notice. I watched the ICU annunciator panel. All green. The ICU load was now drawing directly from the utility mains, bypassing the faulty UPS. Next, we had to power down the UPS itself. This involved opening the main breaker to the unit, then allowing its internal batteries to fully discharge. The amber light on the UPS panel finally extinguished. The fan whoosh slowly died down, replaced by an eerie silence in the equipment room. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. The UPS rack, usually a source of constant noise and heat, was now a cold, inert metal box. We waited for a period, ensuring the system was completely de-energized. Then, we began the restart procedure. The facilities manager closed the main breaker. The fans whirred back to life, and the inverter whine slowly built back to its familiar pitch. The UPS panel lit up, cycling through its diagnostic checks. After a few minutes, the green "Mains Online" indicator illuminated. The system had successfully resynchronized with the utility power. The final step was to transfer the ICU load back through the now functioning UPS. The facilities manager engaged the final switch. Another thunk. I checked the ICU annunciator panel. All green. The UPS was now online, charging its batteries and providing conditioned power to the critical care units. The entire process had taken well over an hour, a tense period of focused procedural work. We logged the incident, noting the specific UPS model and the steps taken. The official report would detail the UPS refusal to transfer and the cold reboot required. I still think about that night sometimes, the quiet dread of a critical system failing in such a subtle way. The constant hum of the hospital, usually a comfort, now holds a different meaning. I still hear the inverter whine in my memory, a sound that once signified normal operation, but for a time became a whisper of something deeply wrong. I was performing my routine late-night rounds in the hospital plant, checking equipment logs. A storm front had moved in, bringing a sharp cold and a steady rain against the roof. The usual hum of the facility felt slightly off, a barely perceptible shift in the low-frequency vibration. My job as a plant operator involved constant vigilance over the hospital's critical systems. This particular night, the air outside was thick with fog, pressing against the windows of the utility corridor. I could see the faint glow of distant headlights through the mist, moving slowly on the access road. The cold seeped into the concrete walls, making the air inside the plant feel sharper than usual. I had just finished reviewing the boiler pressure readings when the first indication of trouble arrived. It was not an alarm, but a subtle dip in the main power grid's frequency, a momentary waver that I felt more than heard. The lights flickered almost imperceptibly, a brief stutter in their steady glow. My internal clock immediately registered the anomaly. The hospital's emergency power system was designed for seamless transition. A brownout or complete mains loss would trigger the automatic transfer switch, or ATS, within moments. The diesel generators would then warm up and stage their load, ensuring uninterrupted power to critical care areas like the ICU pods. My routine checks included verifying the fuel levels, battery charge, and coolant temperatures of the generators, especially during adverse weather. I had completed these checks earlier in the evening, noting everything in the logbook. The system was robust, built to withstand significant disruptions. We had drills for every conceivable failure mode, from frequency drift to phase imbalance. The quiet hum of the plant was usually a comforting sound, a testament to its steady operation. The main power grid failed completely a few minutes later. The lights in the corridor extinguished, plunging the area into a sudden, profound darkness. Emergency lights flickered on almost instantly, casting long, stark shadows. The familiar sequence began. The loud thud of the main breaker opening, followed by the distinct whine of the diesel generators spooling up in their soundproofed room. I moved quickly towards the ATS alcove, my flashlight beam cutting through the dimness. The transfer switch engaged with a solid metallic clunk, signaling the shift to generator power. This was all standard procedure, a well-rehearsed ballet of machinery. I proceeded to the generator room, a secure area accessible only to authorized personnel. The heavy steel door muffled the roar of the engines, but the vibration was palpable through the concrete floor. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the smell of diesel. The two massive generators were running, their engines a steady, powerful thrum. I checked the control panel, confirming voltage and frequency were stable. Everything appeared normal. The system was performing as expected, supplying power to the hospital's critical loads. I noted the time of the transfer in my logbook, along with the initial readings. It was then that I heard it. A distinct metallic knock, originating from the contactor bank responsible for staging the load. The contactors are large electrical switches that connect different sections of the hospital's electrical system to the generators in a carefully timed sequence. This staging prevents a sudden surge that could damage equipment. The first knock was sharp, a single, resonant strike against metal. I glanced at the warm-up schedule displayed on the control panel. The generator was in its initial warm-up phase, preparing to take on the first block of load. A few seconds later, another knock sounded, identical to the first. Then another, and another, each separated by a precise interval. It was a rhythmic progression, a steady, measured count. I watched the warm-up timer on the panel. The knocks aligned perfectly with the seconds ticking down before the next load contactor was scheduled to engage. One knock for each second. This was not normal. The contactors were designed to close silently, or with a single solid click, not a series of distinct percussive strikes. I had never heard anything like it in all my years. I moved closer to the contactor bank, shining my flashlight over the heavy-duty relays and wiring. The sound seemed to emanate from within the sealed enclosures. The rhythm continued, a steady, unsettling count that seemed to echo the passage of time itself. The generator's hum provided a low background drone, but the knocks cut through it with unnerving clarity. I could feel a faint vibration in the metal casing of the contactors with each strike. It was a physical manifestation of something deeply wrong with the system's internal mechanics. I retrieved my portable audio recorder from my utility belt. It was a small, rugged device I used for documenting unusual machinery sounds. I held it near the contactor bank, capturing the precise rhythm of the knocks. The sound was clear, a series of sharp, resonant impacts. The warm-up schedule indicated that the generator would be fully online and stable within a few minutes. The knocks persisted until the final contactor engaged, signaling full load. Then, abruptly, they stopped. The generator's hum returned to its normal, steady drone. I left the generator room and walked back down the plant corridor, the emergency lights still providing the only illumination. The corridor was long and empty, its concrete walls amplifying every sound. As I walked, I noticed something else. The echo of the knocks, now distant, seemed to follow me. The sound bounced off the hard surfaces, creating a peculiar acoustic effect. It was not just an echo. It was as if the metallic strikes were being replayed, softened and distorted by the distance. The rhythm, however, remained. In the quiet of the corridor, the faint rhythmic sound began to resemble something else entirely. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, keeping pace with my own. I stopped walking, listening intently. The sound stopped too. When I moved again, the faint, echoing rhythm resumed. It was an auditory illusion, I told myself, a trick of the acoustics in the empty corridor. The sound was too regular, too mechanical to be actual footsteps. Yet the implication was unsettling. The corridor was supposed to be empty. No one else was scheduled to be in this section of the plant. I continued my rounds, but the experience had left a cold knot in my stomach. The storm outside continued to rage, the wind a low whisper against the roof exhaust stacks. I returned to the facilities office, where the remote annunciator panel displayed the status of all critical systems. No alarms were active. The power grid was still down, but the hospital was running smoothly on generator power. I reviewed the event logs, looking for any anomalies in the ATS transfer or generator performance. There was nothing out of the ordinary recorded, just the standard sequence of events. The system had performed its function perfectly, at least according to the digital record. The NOX, however, were not logged. I sat at my desk and played back the audio recording. The metallic strikes were clear, precise, and perfectly spaced. I cross-referenced the recording with the generator's warm-up schedule. Each knock corresponded exactly to a second ticking down before a load contactor was due to close. It was a countdown, a mechanical pulse, marking the passage of time until full power was restored. But why? Why would the contactors produce such a sound? They were sealed units, designed for quiet, efficient operation. This was not a normal operational sound. It was a distinct, percussive signal. I spent the next hour reviewing maintenance files for the contactor bank. There were no previous reports of similar knocking sounds. The units had been serviced recently, with no issues noted. I considered the possibility of a loose component, but the regularity and precision of the knocks argued against it. A loose part would likely produce an irregular, rattling sound, not a perfectly timed count. The cold outside seemed to intensify, and I could feel the frost forming on the window panes. The static on the old two-way radio on my desk crackled faintly, a reminder of the isolation of the night. I made a detailed entry in my logbook, describing the incident, the precise timing of the knocks, and my observations. I attached the audio recording to the incident report file. I knew that without a clear mechanical fault or an alarm code, this would likely be filed as an unexplained anomaly. The hospital's power systems were complex, and sometimes strange things happened during major power events. Yet the precision of the knocks, their alignment with the warm-up schedule, felt too deliberate to be a random malfunction. It felt like a message, a rhythmic signal from within the machine. The main power grid was restored a little past dawn. The ATS performed its reverse transfer, and the generators shut down, their roar fading to a quiet hum. The hospital returned to its normal rhythm. I filed my report, including the audio evidence. The engineering team reviewed it, but without a recurring issue or a clear cause, no immediate action was taken beyond a general inspection. They found nothing out of place. The contactors appeared to be functioning perfectly. I still have the audio recording. Sometimes, late at night, when the hospital is quiet and the only sound is the low hum of the ventilation system, I play it back. The metallic knocks are still there, precise and unsettling. I hear them sometimes in the quiet of the plant corridor, even when no power event is occurring. It is a phantom rhythm, a ghost in the machine, a silent count that only I seem to hear. I was the night supervisor on duty that evening. A cold front had moved in, bringing a thick fog across the city. The main power grid flickered briefly just after midnight. My role involved overseeing all clinical operations across the hospital during the late hours. The facility was a large regional center, sprawling across several acres, and the night shift often felt like a separate world. The air inside was kept at a consistent temperature, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. My rounds typically began in the intensive care unit, a quiet expanse of glass and specialized equipment. I checked the patient census, reviewed staffing levels, and ensured all critical systems were functioning as expected. The low hum of medical devices and the soft whisper of the ventilation system were constant companions. This particular night, the storm front had been building for hours, and the atmosphere felt heavy, almost expectant. The forecast had mentioned high winds and potential for ice accumulation, a combination that always put the facilities team on edge. I had already spoken with the plant manager, who confirmed the generators were primed and ready. The hospital's power infrastructure was robust, designed with multiple redundancies. When the main utility feed failed, an automatic transfer switch, or ATS, would seamlessly shift the load to our diesel generators. These massive machines, housed in a separate building, would warm up and synchronize within moments. Critical areas like the ICU were also backed by uninterruptible power supplies, or UPS units, providing a brief ride-through period during the transfer. This system usually worked without a hitch, a testament to meticulous maintenance and regular testing. My experience over many years had taught me to trust the system, but also to remain vigilant. I carried a small flashlight on my belt, a habit from earlier days when power events were less predictable. The night was long, and the quiet isolation of the corridors often amplified small sounds. The first true irregularity occurred around 1 in the morning. I was at a nurse documentation station, reviewing a patient chart. The overhead fluorescent lights dimmed noticeably, then brightened, then dimmed again, settling at a lower intensity. This was a brownout, not a full outage, indicating a significant voltage drop on the utility side. The UPS units in the ICU immediately engaged, their internal fans spooling up with a soft whoosh. A few seconds later, the remote annunciator panel in the facilities office would have registered the event. I noted the time mentally and continued my rounds, heading towards the main ICU corridor. The air felt colder than usual, a subtle shift in the carefully controlled environment. As I walked down the corridor, past the glass-fronted patient pods, I noticed a distinct, rhythmic sound. It was a low thud, a soft impact, repeating at a steady cadence. The sound seemed to originate from the ceiling, specifically from the large return air dampers positioned above the glass partitions. Each thud was followed by a faint, fabric-like lift, almost like a heavy curtain being drawn back quickly. The rhythm was slow, deliberate, like a person walking with a heavy gait. It sounded like footsteps, a heel-like rhythm moving along the ceiling above the ICU. I paused, listening intently. The sound was not loud, but it was persistent, cutting through the usual hum of the equipment. I checked the nearest patient pod. The patient inside was stable, sleeping soundly. The monitors displayed normal vital signs. No alarms were active. I moved to the next pod, then the next. The sound continued, following me, or rather, seeming to move in parallel above me. It was always just ahead, or just behind, never directly overhead. The brownout condition persisted, the lights still slightly muted. I could see the subtle flicker in the overhead fixtures. I knew the building management system would be logging every fluctuation. The rhythmic thudding was unsettling. It was too regular, too deliberate to be random structural noise. I walked to the end of the corridor, where a small utility closet housed an airflow meter. This device measured the pressure and velocity of air moving through the ventilation system. I accessed the digital display. The readings were fluctuating more than usual, showing slight but consistent drops in pressure, coinciding with the rhythmic thud. The meter was capturing the pulses. The brownout was causing the variable air volume, or VAV, boxes to struggle. These boxes regulate airflow to maintain temperature and pressure in different zones. The reduced voltage meant the damper motors were not receiving stable power. They were fluttering, opening and closing slightly, creating the thudding sound as the damper blades hit their stops. The fabric-like lift was the sound of the air pressure momentarily shifting. I contacted the plant manager via radio. His voice was calm, but I could hear the faint static in the background. He confirmed the utility feed was unstable, with significant frequency drift and phase imbalance. The generators were attempting to synchronize, but the grid was too erratic for a clean transfer. He was working with the utility company, but they had no estimated time for restoration. The rhythmic thudding continued, a constant low presence above the glass. It felt like something was pacing the ceiling, just out of sight. The sound was entirely mechanical, a product of failing power and struggling machinery, yet it carried an unnerving quality. It was the sound of a system under stress, mimicking something organic. I decided to document the event thoroughly. I retrieved a small handheld thermal camera from the facilities office. The camera could detect subtle temperature changes, which might indicate overheating motors or stressed components in the VAV boxes. As I walked back to the ICU, the rhythmic thudding seemed to intensify slightly. The air felt even colder now, a chill that seeped into the bones. I aimed the camera at the ceiling panels above the glass. The thermal images showed slight temperature spikes around the damper mechanisms, consistent with increased motor activity. I took several photographs, logging the time and location for each. The data would be crucial for the incident report. The plant manager called back on the radio. He had initiated a manual transfer sequence. This was a more controlled, slower process, designed to minimize disruption during unstable grid conditions. The lights in the ICU flickered once more, then brightened to their full intensity. The rhythmic thudding from the ceiling immediately ceased. The airflow meter reading stabilized. The hum of the UPS units softened as they disengaged, their work done. The hospital was now running entirely on generator power. The transition was complete, but the memory of the sound lingered. It had been a purely mechanical phenomenon, yet the illusion of footsteps had been profound. I completed my rounds, checking the oxygen manifold pressures and ensuring all critical care equipment was functioning correctly on generator power. The night passed without further incident. In the morning, I filed a detailed report, including my observations, the airflow meter readings, and the thermal photographs. The facilities team later confirmed that several VAV box motors had indeed been stressed by the brownout. They initiated a preventative maintenance schedule for those specific units. The logbook entry for that night was extensive, documenting every fluctuation and every response. The incident was closed, filed away as a technical anomaly. Yet, sometimes, late at night, when the hospital is quiet and the air is still, I can almost hear that low, rhythmic thudding again. It is a quiet whisper of a sound, a memory of something that was not there, but felt undeniably present. I was on my usual late-night facilities rounds. The air outside was cold, carrying the scent of wet asphalt. A faint, rhythmic sound began to register from the main corridor. My job as a facilities runner involved monitoring the hospital's critical systems, especially during storm fronts. This particular night, a heavy rain had been falling for hours, driven by a strong wind. The hospital was a sprawling complex, and my route covered everything from the main power plant to the farthest patient wings. I carried a radio, a set of master keys, and a small toolkit. The hum of the building's machinery was a constant companion, a low thrum that usually faded into the background. My focus was on the annunciator panels, the oxygen manifold pressures, and the general integrity of the infrastructure. I checked the logbook entries from the previous shift, noting the generator warm-up cycle had completed without incident earlier in the evening. The hospital relied on a robust auto-transfer switch sequencing, but a storm always introduced variables. I walked the plant corridor, feeling the vibration of the diesel genset room through the concrete floor. Everything appeared normal, the gauges steady, the lights unwavering. The sound became clearer as I approached the facility's office alcove. It was a distinct, high-pitched ping, repeating with unnerving regularity. I recognized it as an annunciator alert, but it was not one I had heard before. The remote annunciator panel, a large display board with hundreds of indicator lights, was mounted on the wall. It was designed to provide a centralized overview of system faults across the entire facility. Most of the lights were green, indicating normal operation. A few amber lights glowed, signaling minor, non-critical issues that were already logged for maintenance. The ping was coming from this panel. I stopped, listening intently. It sounded precisely every minute, a sharp, electronic tone that cut through the ambient hum of the building. I checked my watch. The ping occurred at exactly 12 seconds past the minute, every minute. I pulled out my key card and accessed the facilities office. The panel's internal speaker was the source of the noise. I consulted the panel history display, scrolling through recent events. There were no new critical alarms. The system log showed only routine status updates. I cross-referenced the audible alarm with the visual indicators. No new red lights were active. This was unusual. An audible alarm without a corresponding visual fault code was a rare occurrence, suggesting a deeper, more obscure issue. I radioed Central Dispatch, reporting the anomaly. The static on the line was heavier than usual, a common side effect of the storm. They confirmed no new alarms had registered on their primary system. This meant the fault was localized to this specific remote panel, or its connection to the main network was compromised. I began a methodical check. The panel itself was a complex piece of equipment, fed by dozens of sensor loops from various parts of the hospital. Each loop was a circuit designed to detect a specific condition, like a door left ajar, a pump failure, or a pressure drop. The ping indicated a lost loop, a circuit that had gone open or short. The problem was, the panel wasn't identifying which loop. It was simply signaling a general communication error. I retrieved a portable loop tester from the office cabinet. The air in the office felt slightly colder than the corridor, a subtle difference I attributed to the storm's influence on the building's envelope. I began checking the main input lines to the annunciator panel, one by one. Each connection was secure, the wiring intact. The tester showed continuity on all primary circuits. The ping continued, relentless, a constant reminder of an unresolved issue. The storm outside intensified. I could hear the rain lashing against the roof above, a steady roar that occasionally drowned out the ping for a moment. The wind howled, creating a low whisper around the roof exhaust stacks. I considered the possibility of a power fluctuation. During storm fronts, brownouts or frequency drift could cause transient faults. I checked the local power supply to the panel. The voltage was stable, the frequency within tolerance. The UPS ride-through system for the panel was functioning correctly. This wasn't a power event. This was something else, something more specific to the data loops themselves. The persistent, unidentifiable ping started to grate on my nerves. It was a sound of something broken, something out of place, in a system designed for absolute reliability. I reviewed the panel's schematics, tracing the network of conduits that fed into it. Many of these conduits ran through the roof space, carrying sensor wires from various rooftop units, including the oxygen and vacuum panels and environmental monitors. The summary mentioned roof runoff. This was a critical clue. Water ingress into a conduit could cause a wet splice, shorting out a circuit or creating an intermittent connection. A wet splice would explain a lost loop that wasn't consistently registering as a hard fault. It would also explain the intermittent nature of the ping, if the water level fluctuated. The thought of water compromising critical wiring in the roof space during a storm was not a comforting one. I radioed dispatch again, requesting a facilities technician with roof access clearance. The radio crackled, the static making the voice on the other end sound distant and distorted. They acknowledged the request, but warned of delays due to the severe weather. The roof was a dangerous place in a storm like this. I knew I couldn't wait. The ping, now a constant presence in the quiet night, felt like a countdown. A lost loop in a critical care environment could have serious implications, even if the panel wasn't identifying a specific system. It represented an unknown vulnerability. I grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight and my personal set of roof keys. The access hatch to the roof was located down a long, dimly lit plant corridor. The air grew colder as I approached it, a chill seeping in from the outside. I could hear the roar of the wind more clearly now, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the metal hatch. I unlocked it, the heavy steel door groaning as I pushed it open. A blast of cold, wet air hit me. The rain was coming down in sheets, visibility severely limited by the fog and the darkness. My flashlight beam struggled to penetrate the driving rain. The roof was slick with water, the gravel surface treacherous. I moved slowly, carefully, keeping my radio close. I navigated towards the area where the conduits for the annunciator panel were routed. The roof was a maze of vents, pipes, and equipment, all shrouded in the storm. I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The sound of the rain was deafening, but even through it, I could still faintly hear the distant, rhythmic ping from below. It was a phantom sound, carried on the wind, or perhaps just echoing in my mind. I found the main conduit run, a thick bundle of armored cable leading towards a junction box. The box was designed to be watertight, but years of exposure to the elements could compromise its integrity. As I got closer, my flashlight beam caught something. A small stream of water was trickling from beneath the junction box cover, running down the side of the conduit. This was it. Water ingress. I carefully unlatched the cover, the metal cold and slick under my gloved fingers. Inside, the wiring was visibly wet. One of the splices, a connection point where multiple wires joined, was glistening with water. It was a simple, insulated connection, but the constant moisture had compromised it. The water was creating an intermittent short, causing the lost loop signal. I could see the tiny drip of water falling directly onto the splice from a hairline crack in the conduit above. I worked quickly, despite the driving rain and the biting cold. My hands were numb, but the urgency of the situation kept me focused. I used a specialized drying agent from my kit, carefully applying it to the wet splice and the surrounding wiring. Then, I sealed the crack in the conduit with a temporary patch, a heavy-duty waterproof tape. It wouldn't be a permanent fix, but it would hold until the storm passed and proper repairs could be made. I re-secured the junction box cover, making sure it was as watertight as possible. The wind whipped around me, threatening to tear the cover from my grasp. I double-checked my work, then began the slow, careful descent back into the building. Back in the facilities office, the silence was immediate and profound. The ping had stopped. I checked the annunciator panel. All lights were green, save for the usual amber indicators. The panel history showed no new faults. I radioed dispatch, confirming the resolution. They logged the incident as a wet splice, conduit ingress. The facilities technician arrived a short while later, surprised I had managed to locate and temporarily fix the issue in such conditions. We filed a detailed report, outlining the temporary repair and scheduling a full conduit replacement for the following day. The logbook entry was concise, factual. The storm continued for several more hours, but the ping never returned. I finished my rounds, the quiet hum of the building restored to its normal rhythm. The incident was officially closed, a routine maintenance issue resolved. Yet, the memory of that persistent, rhythmic ping, 12 seconds past the minute, stayed with me. It was a sound of something unseen, something broken, lurking just beneath the surface of a critical system. I still hear it sometimes, in the quiet moments of a late night, a phantom echo of a lost loop. If this story pulled you in, make sure to subscribe. We post new ones every day, steady as a campfire burning in the dark. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and which part of tonight's story stayed with you the most. It's always wild seeing what hits people across different places.